To you, what would virtue be? Because to most people, it's this mystical, magical, metaphysical thing that comes from the sky, and you're unable to attain it unless you somehow go through some monk transformation, or you go to Zen mode, or do a dopamine detox for a year straight. In my opinion, if you simply step on a snail and feel bad about it, you have virtue. If you see somebody littering in public and you feel irritated quietly about it, not at the inconvenience of someone cleaning that up, but instead at the wrongness of it, thinking to yourself, how could somebody just do that so casually? You have virtue. If you watch someone being publicly humiliated and you feel a tightness in your chest, even if it's before you've had time yourself to react, then you have virtue. You have the feeling of virtue, not the performance, not the act of it. You have inherent virtue and morals. It's not an aspiration towards being virtuous. It's the thing itself already present in your life, already operating under its own circumstances and already telling you something about what you believe the world itself should be, or should at least try to be. Virtue is not a mountain that you climb, nor is it a trench that you swim to the bottom of. It was never either of those things. It was never a hardship, but somewhere in the distance between where it started and now where it's ended up, it became one. It became something that you had to work towards. Now, the word virtue originated from the Latin word virtus. It was in 1st century BC in the Roman Republic that it originated. It meant excellence, that was it. Not moral excellence specifically, but instead excellence of any sense. Excellence in the expression of human capacity, courage or strength, or the qualities that made someone function at their highest level. A virtuous person, or a virtuous Roman, was not necessarily a kind person like they would be nowadays, but instead was simply the best at their field. A virtuous Roman could simply have been a soldier who was the best at holding down the line, or the senator who had the most clear speaking skills, or a man who simply did what his role and his nature demanded of him to do. Before that, however, the Greeks also had the idea of the arete. It was the same root idea in the sense that it was excellence, or the fullest expression of something's particular nature. Aristotle himself built an entire philosophy around it. It was called eudaimonia. It was the good life. It was the life led best. And it was not happiness in a shallow sense that people nowadays chase, but instead just a life lived in full accordance with arete. The life in which a person completely became what they were capable of being. A knife with arete cuts well. A horse with arete runs well. And a human being with arete thinks, acts, loves, creates, endures, and chooses well. Not perfectly, not incredibly, just well, just good enough to exist and be happy with it. This concept, however, moved through history and then changed shape at every single stop. The Stoics took virtue at face value and made it the only good to have. Not wealth nor pleasure, not health nor reputation, but instead virtue alone. Everything else was either preferred or dispreferred. Either you wanted it or you didn't want it, and you could attain it or you didn't need to attain it. But ultimately they were indifferent. However, virtue was a requirement. In my opinion, this was a radical perception of virtue. It meant that a slave who was practicing virtue was living a better life than an emperor who wasn't. However, Epictetus, who was born in chains, born as a slave, which I made a video about recently, understood this much more completely than any other Stoic, or most people who have ever written about it have actually ever comprehended, because they wrote about it from comfort. However, Epictetus, born as a slave, knew the hardships of being virtuous. Then Christianity absorbed the concept and then reframed it to what they needed it to be. The cardinal virtues, which were prudence and justice and fortitude and temperance, and they all became theological values or virtues. Faith or hope or charity, all of these things in a sense are virtue, but they were converted into a religious sense. Virtue moved from the horizontal plane of human excellence and instead turned into divine alignment with a God above. To be virtuous was no longer to be excellent simply. Instead, it was to be good in the eyes of the God, of the all-seeing God above us. The Enlightenment then secularized it again, Kant built virtue around duty, the categorical imperative, the act done simply because it was right, regardless of the consequence of reward. Hume then argued that virtue was rooted in sentiment, in the natural human capacity to feel approval or disapproval in any sense, and to be moved by the suffering of other people before reason has had its time to intervene. That last part, in my opinion, matters a lot more than people expect it to. Hume himself was pointing at the snail that you may have stepped on. The modern world, in my opinion, then inherited all of this. It inherited everything, and it inherited the theological and the secularized values. It inherited the virtuous and the moral or the metaphysical values of virtue. And then, for some reason, it did something very strange with it. It turned virtue into its own performance category. Virtue signaling, which we hear so commonly nowadays, and the phrase itself tells you everything about what it's actually happening to virtue. The accusation that displaying virtue as a human is not the same as having virtue, that the public expression of moral concern is often more about positioning yourself socially on the hierarchy than genuine feeling, and that virtue in the age of the audience became something that you showed rather than something that you inherently were as a person. And in my opinion, the accusation is not entirely wrong, but the problem with it is that it produced its own problems. It made people suspicious of their own genuine moral responses. I can't say that word, moral. The quiet irritation at the litter and the tightening in the chest at the humiliation and the bad feeling about killing the snail. All of it became suspect. All of it became a pondering thought in the mind instead of just natural virtue or natural morals. All of it was potentially performance in the mind of the performer, and it was potentially self-interest dressed as ethics. Again, potentially just another form of a social currency. And in that sense, it lost its availability. Now, what it actually is, in my opinion, or I wouldn't say in my opinion, more from a formed collection of things that I've read in the past. And this is stripped of everything that it's accumulated along the way, because I've read through many of the different time periods, is that virtue is simply the capacity to feel the difference between right and wrong, before you've actually been told which is which. It is the very moral intuition that precedes the moral arguments. It's the thing that makes you wince and react before you've reasoned through why wincing or tightening or reacting to that situation is the appropriate response to that situation. It is not a mystical thing. It is not heaven sent. It is not something that you have to attain by ascending to fucking God and flying up to the sky and becoming an angel or something like that. It's nothing of the sort. It is not the exclusive property of a philosopher or a saint or a cardinal or someone who has read the right books. It is not something that you attain at the end of a long process of becoming a monk or self-improvement. All it really is that it is something that you already have within you. It is in the form of every genuine moral response to everything you've ever had. It's the response that you've had to anything going on throughout your life or throughout anything that you've seen in your life. The question is not now whether or not you have virtue, but instead it's whether or not you trust the virtue that you have. It's whether or not you trust the intuition that virtue guides you upon. It's whether you follow the feeling in your chest before the rationalization arrives to explain it away. It's whether you act on the quiet knowledge that something is wrong or in this situation, or something is wrong about what you're seeing before the calculation of the social hierarchy begins. It's whether or not you let that snail that has died under your foot on accident, maybe on purpose, but hopefully on accident, matter without needing a philosophical framework to justify the feeling of killing it or the feeling of regret over killing it. Aristotle called virtue a habit, not an achievement. It was simply a practice. It was just as going to the gym would be. It was just as wrestling would be to them, or journaling or writing a book. It was simply something that happened day in, day out, and you could build it or you could let it slip away from your life. It was just something developed, and not by thinking about it correctly, but instead by doing it repeatedly and so often intuitionally, if that's even a word, that it simply just became the shape of who you were as a person instead of presenting yourself to the world as something that you were not. you already know what the practice of virtue looks like. You already know what kind of acts are kind enough, or what kind of acts have enough virtue within them to make you a virtuous person. You felt it your entire life. You knew that giving money to someone who was in need of it felt good. But were you able to do it without telling someone that you've just done that? Were you able to, rebuild the bird's nest that you may have accidentally broken down with a soccer ball or a basketball or something in the sense, without acting like you were a great person for fixing what you had already broken? Again, you felt this feeling your entire life. You felt the idea of virtue throughout all of your living, and all you have done from then to now is stopped calling it what it is. So recognize your virtues, recognize who you are as a person and why you are virtuous, and work on that. Because I think if every single person on this planet was virtuous, we'd be living on a completely different earth.